The fluorescent lights in the emergency room cast everything in a sickly yellow glow, making the angry red welts on Laura's arms look even more grotesque than they already were. She sat on the examination table, her legs dangling like a child's, though at 17 she was far from being one. The paper crinkled beneath her with every nervous shift, a sound that seemed to echo louder than her mother's voice explaining, again, how this had all been a terrible accident. Preparing and narrating. This type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So, if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. She was helping me make pasta, Mom said to the triage nurse, her voice carrying that particular tone Lora had learned to recognize over the years. The one that meant, "Believe me, don't ask questions, move along." The pot slipped. You know how clumsy teenagers can be. Lora stared down at her arms, at the perfect parallel lines that ran from her wrists to her elbows. The burns were precise, deliberate, like someone had used a ruler to measure the distance between each scalding stripe. She thought about her sister Maya's face 3 hours ago, the cold satisfaction that had flickered in her dark eyes as she'd poured the boiling water with surgical precision. Maya had been careful to aim just so, to create a pattern that would hurt but not permanently disfigure, not in any way that would be immediately obvious to someone who wasn't looking closely. But patterns tell stories. And Nurse Patricia Chen was the kind of person who read between the lines. Patricia had been working emergency medicine for 15 years, long enough to develop an instinct for the difference between accidents and intentions. She moved around, the examination room with practiced efficiency, her sneakers silent against the linoleum floor. Her black hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her scrubs were decorated with tiny cartoon penguins, an attempt to bring some lightness into a job that dealt primarily in human suffering. "Lora, honey," Patricia said, her voice gentle but firm. "I need to clean these wounds and get a better look at them. This might sting a little." As Patricia began her work, Lora caught her mother's eye in the reflection of the metal cabinet. Mom's face was a carefully constructed mask of maternal concern, but Lora could see the warning there, subtle as a whisper. "Tell the story. Stick to the script. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The hospital smelled like antiseptic and fear, with an underlying current of something else. Hope, maybe, or desperation. It was a smell Lora had become familiar with over the past few years, though never because of injuries quite like these. There had been the fall down the stairs that resulted in 3 cracked ribs, the kitchen accident that left her with a concussion, the bike crash that somehow only managed to bruise her torso in places that would be hidden by clothing. Maya had always been creative in her cruelty. "Tell me exactly how this happened," Patricia said, not looking up from Laura's arms. Her hands were steady as she worked, but Lora could sense something else in her touch, a carefulness that went beyond medical professionalism. "Like my mom said," Lora began, the words feeling like ash in her mouth. "I was helping with dinner. The pot was heavy, and when I tried to drain the pasta—" "The pattern is very interesting," Patricia interrupted softly. She'd taken out her phone and was adjusting the camera settings. "I'm going to take some pictures for your medical records. It's standard procedure for burn injuries." Mom shifted in her chair, the leather squeaking. "Is that really necessary? She's been through enough today." "It's protocol," Patricia replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. The camera flash illuminated the room in stark white bursts, capturing the geometric precision of the burns, the way they avoided certain areas while concentrating on others. Each photograph was time-stamped, geotagged, and automatically uploaded to the hospital's secure server. But Patricia wasn't just taking pictures for the medical records. She was documenting evidence. Dr. James Reeves entered the room like a small hurricane, his white coat billowing behind him. He was in his early 40s, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of intensity that came from too many late nights and too much coffee. He'd seen Patricia's preliminary notes, And something about them had made him prioritize this case over the other patients waiting in the crowded ER. "Good afternoon, I'm Dr. Reeves," he said, washing his hands at the sink. "Lora, I'm going to examine your injuries and make sure we're treating them properly." As he worked, Lora found herself studying the people around her. Her mother sat ramrod straight in the visitor's chair, her purse clutched in her lap like a shield. She was wearing the blue dress she saved for important occasions: church, parent-teacher conferences, hospital visits. Her makeup was perfect despite the supposed emergency, not a hair out of place. Maya hadn't come to the hospital. She was at home, probably in her room, probably reading one of her psychology textbooks or browsing social media with the same detached curiosity she applied to everything in her life. At 19, Maya was 2 years older than Lora, and she wielded that advantage like a weapon. She was studying pre-med at the local community college, maintaining a perfect GPA while conducting what she called behavioral experiments on her younger sister. "The alignment of these burns is unusual," Dr. Reeves murmured, more to himself than to anyone else in the room. "Lora, walk me through what happened one more time. Take your time." The story felt rehearsed because it was. Mom had made her practice it during the 20-minute drive to the hospital, refining the details, smoothing out the inconsistencies. But as Lora began to speak, she noticed Patricia watching her carefully, not just listening to the words, but observing the way she held her body, the micro-expressions that flickered across her face, the way her voice caught on certain phrases. "I was draining the pasta in the colander," Lora said. "Maya was making the sauce. The pot was really full, and I guess I wasn't holding it right. When I tilted it, the water just went everywhere." "And where was Maya when this happened?" Dr. Reeves asked. "Right next to me. She tried to help, but it happened so fast." "Must have been frightening for both of you girls," Patricia said. "Maya didn't get burned at all?" "No, she was lucky, I guess." The lie sat between them like a living thing. Patricia and Dr. Reeves exchanged a glance that lasted perhaps a second longer than necessary. They'd both seen enough in their careers to recognize the signs, to understand the language of concealed violence that families sometimes spoke in waiting rooms and examination rooms. As Dr. Reeves finished his examination and began explaining the treatment plan, wound cleaning, antibiotic ointment, specialized bandages that would need to be changed daily, Lora found herself thinking about the minutes leading up to the incident. She and Maya had been alone in the kitchen while Mom ran to the grocery store. Maya had been unusually quiet, which should have been a warning sign. The conversation had started normally enough. Maya had asked about Laura's plans for the weekend, about a boy named Jake from her chemistry class who had been texting her. But something in Maya's tone had been off, a flatness that Lora had learned to associate with danger. "You think he likes you?" Maya had said, stirring the marinara sauce with mechanical precision. "That's cute." "I don't know. Maybe." "Why?" Maya had smiled then, the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. "No reason. It's just interesting. The stories we tell ourselves." The water had been boiling for the pasta, steam rising from the large pot in serpentine coils. Maya had been standing next to it, wooden spoon in one hand, and Lora had been getting plates down from the cabinet when her sister's voice had turned sharp. "Come here. I want to show you something." And Lora, conditioned by years of small betrayals and calculated cruelties, had obeyed. She always obeyed. That was part of the dynamic they'd fallen into: predator and prey, experimenter and subject. "The burns will heal," Dr. Reeves was saying, "but you'll need to watch for signs of infection. Any increased redness, swelling, or fever, and you come right back here." Patricia was preparing the discharge paperwork, but her movement seemed deliberately slow. She kept glancing at Lora, as if trying to communicate something without words. The camera that had captured the photographs was still sitting on the counter, its screen dark but somehow still present, a silent witness to the geometric precision of the wounds. "Before you go," Patricia said, tearing off a piece of paper from her prescription pad, "I want to give you some resources, just in case you ever need them." She handed the paper to Lora, not to her mother. On it was written a phone number and the words, "Crisis Hotline, Anonymous, 24/7, Safe." Mom reached for the paper, but Lora was faster. She folded it and slipped it into her pocket, meeting Patricia's eyes for just a moment. In that brief exchange, something passed between them, an acknowledgement, a recognition, a promise that this wasn't over. "Thank you," Lora whispered, and Patricia nodded. The drive home was silent except for the radio playing soft rock and the occasional directions from Mom's GPS. Lora stared out the window at the suburban landscape rolling past, strip malls and chain restaurants, perfectly manicured lawns and houses that looked like they belonged in magazines. Everything appeared normal, peaceful, safe. But Lora had learned that surfaces could be deceiving, that the most dangerous predators were often the ones who looked the most harmless. When they pulled into their driveway, Maya's car was gone. A note on the kitchen counter explained that she'd gone to study at the library and would be back for dinner. Mom crumpled the note and threw it away, then began preparing a meal as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Patricia Chen had seen it, had documented it, had quietly started a process that neither Lora nor her family fully understood yet. The photographs were uploaded to the hospital's system, flagged for review, copied to a secure server that social services could access with the proper authorization. And for the first time in years, Lora felt something she'd almost forgotten: how to feel hope. That night, lying in bed with her arms wrapped in pristine white bandages, she took out the paper Patricia had given her. The crisis hotline number seemed to glow in the darkness of her room. She didn't call it, not yet, but she kept it close, a talisman against the darkness that had defined so much of her young life. Outside her window, the suburban night was quiet and still. But change was coming, as inevitable as the sunrise, and it would arrive carrying the weight of photographed evidence and the careful documentation of a nurse who understood that patterns told stories, and some stories demanded to be heard. The question that haunted Lora as she drifted off to sleep wasn't about what had happened in the kitchen that afternoon. It was about what would happen next, now that someone had finally seen the truth and captured it in pixels and metadata, preserved forever in the digital archives of a hospital that took very seriously its obligation to protect the vulnerable. Maya would be home soon, and with her would come new questions, new experiments, new ways to test the boundaries of what she could get away with. But for the first time in years, Lora wouldn't be facing those challenges entirely alone. The next morning arrived with the kind of aggressive cheerfulness that only autumn in suburbia could provide. Sunlight streamed through Laura's bedroom window, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny fragments of hope. She woke to the sound of her mother making breakfast downstairs, the sizzle of bacon and the cheerful clink of plates being set on the kitchen table, the domestic symphony of a family that looked perfect from the outside. Her arms throbbed with a deep, persistent ache that the pain medication couldn't quite touch. The bandages felt tight against her skin, a constant reminder of yesterday's accident, and the careful precision with which Maya had created those geometric burns. Lora sat up slowly, testing the range of motion in her arms, wincing at the way the damaged skin pulled and stretched with even the smallest movement. The mirror on her dresser reflected back a girl who looked older than her 17 years, with dark circles under her eyes and a wariness that had settled into her features like a permanent shadow. She'd inherited her father's height and her mother's delicate bone structure, but somewhere along the way, she'd developed a way of holding herself that suggested someone accustomed to making herself small, invisible, forgettable. "Lora, breakfast." Mom's voice drifted up from the kitchen, artificially bright. Getting dressed was a challenge. Her school clothes, jeans and a long-sleeved t-shirt that would hide the bandages, felt foreign against her injured skin. She'd become an expert at concealment over the years, learning which fabrics wouldn't show bruises, which sleeves would cover marks, which makeup could disguise the evidence of Maya's experiments. The kitchen smelled like vanilla coffee and burned toast, Mom's signature breakfast combination. She was standing at the stove, still in her bathrobe, her hair pulled back in the kind of messy bun that somehow looked effortless and beautiful. At 42, Susan Martinez had maintained the kind of appearance that made other mothers envious. Slim, well-dressed, with laugh lines that suggested a life filled with joy and contentment. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" she asked without turning around. "Better," Lora lied, sliding into her usual spot at the kitchen table. The chair faced the window that looked out onto the Hendersons' backyard, where their golden retriever was chasing squirrels with eternal optimism. Maya's chair sat empty across from her, still pulled out from wherever she'd left it the night before. Her coffee cup was in the sink, rinsed but not washed, a small act of consideration that was somehow more unsettling than outright mess would have been. Maya was always careful about leaving evidence, always mindful of maintaining her image as the responsible, mature daughter. "Maya left early for her study group," Mom said, setting a plate in front of Lora. "She wanted me to tell you she's sorry about yesterday. She feels terrible about what happened." The apology by proxy was classic Maya, a way of expressing regret, without having to actually face the person she'd hurt. Lora had received dozens of these secondhand apologies over the years, always filtered through their mother, always phrased in a way that suggested Maya's remorse was genuine and deep while avoiding any actual admission of wrongdoing. "She says she keeps replaying it in her mind," Mom continued, settling into her own chair with a cup of coffee that steamed in the morning light, wondering if there was something she could have done differently to prevent it. Lora stared down at her eggs, watching the way the yolk bled across the white in golden streams. She could prevent it, she thought. She could choose not to hurt me. But that thought was too dangerous to voice, too loaded with implications that would shatter the careful fiction their family had constructed around Maya's behavior. The high school was a 15-minute drive from their house, long enough for Mom to cycle through her usual topics of conversation: Lora's grades, good but not exceptional like Maya's; her college plans, undefined and anxiety-inducing; her social life, carefully monitored and subtly discouraged. The questions came wrapped in maternal concern, but Lora had learned to hear the subtext. Don't excel too much. Don't outshine your sister. Don't complicate things. Remember, if anyone asks about your arms, it was just a kitchen accident, Mom said as they pulled into the school parking lot. These things happen. No need to make it into a big drama. Jefferson High School sprawled across 15 acres of carefully maintained lawns and modern architecture, a monument to suburban educational ambition. Lora had been attending for 3 years, moving through its halls like a ghost, maintaining a careful balance between academic competence and social invisibility. She'd learned early that standing out in any direction, too smart, too pretty, too successful, would inevitably result in Maya's attention, and Maya's attention always carried a price. Her first period was AP English with Mrs. Rodriguez, a woman in her 50s who taught literature with the passion of someone who genuinely believed that books could change lives. The classroom smelled like old paper and whiteboard markers, with motivational posters covering every available wall space. Reading is dreaming with open eyes. Books are uniquely portable magic. The kind of inspirational phrases that would have seemed cheesy anywhere else, but somehow felt genuine in Mrs. Rodriguez's domain. Lora took her usual seat in the third row, far enough from the front to avoid unwanted attention, but close enough to participate when called upon. Her best friend Casey slid into the seat next to her, offering a sympathetic smile when she noticed the way Lora was favoring her arms. Casey Washington was everything Lora wasn't: confident, outspoken, unafraid to take up space in the world. They'd been friends since middle school, bonding over a shared love of science fiction novels and a mutual disdain for the social hierarchies that governed teenage life. Casey was one of the few people who knew about Maya's experiments, though Lora had never told her the full extent of what happened behind the closed doors of the Martinez house. "Kitchen accident," Lora said before Casey could ask, the explanation feeling more rehearsed with each repetition. "Uh-huh," Casey replied, her tone suggesting she wasn't entirely buying the story, but was willing to let it slide for now. Mrs. Rodriguez was discussing To Kill a Mockingbird, focusing on the theme of moral courage and the ways that ordinary people could choose to do extraordinary things in the face of injustice. She talked about Atticus Finch's decision to defend Tom Robinson despite the social pressure to conform, about Scout's growing understanding of the complex moral landscape of her community. "Courage," Mrs. Rodriguez said, "isn't the absence of fear. It's acting in spite of fear, choosing to do what's right even when it's difficult or dangerous." The words seemed to echo in Lora's mind as she sat there, Patricia Chen's phone number, folded in her backpack like a secret. Was it courage that had led the nurse to document those photographs, to slip her that piece of paper? Or was it simply professional obligation, the kind of routine intervention that happened every day in emergency rooms across the country? During lunch, Lora and Casey sat at their usual table in the far corner of the cafeteria, away from the social epicenter where the popular kids held court. Casey was picking at her salad while scrolling through college brochures on her phone, planning an escape route that would take her far from the suburban monotony of their hometown. "I've been thinking about what you said the other day," Casey said, not looking up from her phone. "About feeling like you're trapped in someone else's story." Lora had said that during one of their late-night conversations, when the weight of her family's expectations and Maya's manipulations had felt particularly crushing. She'd described her life as feeling like she was a supporting character in a narrative controlled by other people with no agency over her own plot development. What about it? "I think the problem is that you're waiting for permission to be the protagonist of your own life, but nobody's going to give you that permission. You have to take it." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jake Morrison, the boy from chemistry class who had been texting Lora with increasing frequency over the past few weeks. He was tall and lanky, with the kind of earnest smile that suggested someone who hadn't yet learned to be cynical about the world. He slid into the empty chair next to Lora, his lunch tray clattering against the table. "Hey," he said, his eyes immediately going to her bandaged arms. "What happened?" "Cooking accident," Lora replied automatically, then caught Casey's eye. Her friend was giving her a look that clearly said, "Really? Again?" Jake seemed to accept the explanation at face value, launching into a story about his own kitchen mishaps and the time he'd accidentally set off the smoke alarm trying to make grilled cheese. His presence was comfortable, undemanding, free from the subtle psychological warfare that characterized most of Lora's interactions at home. As he talked, Lora found herself studying his face, trying to understand what Maya had seen when she'd made her comments about him the previous day. Jake was kind, funny in an understated way, and genuinely interested in what Lora had to say, qualities that seemed to exist in a different universe from the calculated cruelty that defined her relationship with her sister. The rest of the school day passed in a haze of note-taking and half-remembered lectures. Chemistry class brought back unwelcome memories of Maya's pre-med studies, the way she would casually discuss the effects of various substances on human physiology, always with that detached scientific curiosity that made Lora's skin crawl. History. Class covered the Holocaust with the kind of academic distance that made atrocity feel theoretical, abstract, divorced from the very real capacity for human cruelty that Lora had witnessed up close. By the time she got home that afternoon, Maya's car was already in the driveway. Lora sat in Mom's passenger seat for a moment longer than necessary, steeling herself for whatever new dynamic awaited her inside the house. Through the living room window, she could see her sister sitting at the dining room table, textbooks spread around her in careful organization, the picture of academic dedication. "She's been studying all day," Mom said, following Lora's gaze. "She's taking her midterms very seriously. You know how important her GPA is for medical school applications." Maya's academic success was a family obsession, talked about with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. She'd maintained a perfect 4.0 throughout high school and was well on her way to repeating that achievement in college. Teachers loved her, administrators praised her, and she'd already received preliminary interest from several medical schools based on her test scores and extracurricular activities. What none of them knew was that Maya had been conducting her own informal psychological experiments for years, using Lora as her primary subject. She was fascinated by pain responses, by the ways that fear could be used to modify behavior, by the delicate ecosystem of power and control that existed within families. Her burns on Lora's arms weren't random acts of cruelty. They were data, collection, part of a long-term study on trauma and resilience that existed only in Maya's mind. Inside the house, Maya looked up from her textbooks with an expression of carefully constructed concern. "Lora, how are you feeling? I've been worried about you all day." The performance was flawless, delivered with exactly the right combination of sisterly affection and guilty remorse. If Lora hadn't been the one on the receiving end of those precisely aimed streams of boiling water, she might have been convinced by the sincerity in Maya's voice. "I'm fine," Lora replied, dropping her backpack by the door and heading for the stairs. "Wait," Maya said, standing up from the table. "I wanted to apologize for yesterday. I keep thinking that if I'd just been more careful, if I'd paid better attention—" "It's fine, Maya. Really." "No, it's not fine. You got hurt because I wasn't thinking clearly. I should have been watching what you were doing, should have helped you handle that pot." Maya's voice carried exactly the right note of self-recrimination, the tone of someone genuinely tormented by their role in an unfortunate accident. Lora nodded and continued toward the stairs. But Maya wasn't finished. "I brought you something," she said, picking up a small bag from the table. "I stopped by the pharmacy on my way home and got some of those fancy bandages, the kind that are supposed to heal faster, and some of that antibiotic cream the doctor mentioned." The gesture was thoughtful, considerate, exactly the kind of thing a caring older sister would do. Maya held out the bag with a smile that looked completely genuine, and for a moment, Lora felt the familiar confusion that always accompanied these interactions. Was it possible that she'd misunderstood yesterday's events? Could Maya's expression of satisfaction have been her imagination, a trauma response that had distorted her perception of what actually happened? "Thank you," Lora said, taking the bag. Inside were the bandages and cream Maya had mentioned, along with a small chocolate bar, Lora's favorite kind. "I know chocolate doesn't fix anything," Maya said with a self-deprecating laugh, "but I thought it might make you feel a little better." Upstairs in her room, Lora sat on her bed and stared at Maya's gifts. The kindness felt genuine, but she'd learned not to trust her instincts when it came to her sister. Maya was capable of extraordinary empathy when it served her purposes, able to manufacture concern and affection with the same precision she applied to her academic work. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her text messages, looking for something real, something uncomplicated. Jake had sent her a funny meme about chemistry class, and Casey had shared a link to a scholarship program for students interested in journalism. Normal teenage interactions, free from the psychological complexity that defined her family relationships. As evening approached, the house settled into its familiar rhythms. Dad came home from his job at the insurance company, bringing with him the scent of coffee and office air conditioning. He was a quiet man who had learned to navigate around his family's emotional dynamics rather than through them, a strategy that kept the peace but left important questions unasked and uncomfortable truths unexamined. Dinner conversation focused on Maya's upcoming midterms, her volunteer work at the local hospital, her impressive performance in organic chemistry. Lora contributed when asked direct questions but otherwise remained quiet, picking at her food and counting the minutes until she could reasonably excuse herself from the table. After dinner, she helped with the dishes, standing next to Maya at the sink in a carefully choreographed dance of domestic normalcy. Maya washed while Lora dried, their movements synchronized by years of practice. To anyone watching, they would have looked like any pair of sisters sharing household chores, comfortable in each other's presence. "I've been thinking about what happened yesterday," Maya said quietly, her voice barely audible over the running water. "About how accidents can change everything in just a few seconds." Lora kept her eyes on the plate she was drying, not trusting herself to look at her sister's face. "It made me realize how fragile everything is," Maya continued. "How quickly things can go wrong, even when everyone involved has the best intentions." The words could be interpreted as profound reflection on the nature of accidents and human vulnerability. But Lora heard the subtext, the subtle threat wrapped in philosophical observation. Maya was reminding her that danger could strike at any time, that safety was an illusion, that even the most careful person could find themselves at the mercy of forces beyond their control. That night, lying in bed with her arms still throbbing despite the pain medication, Lora finally took out the piece of paper Patricia had given her. The crisis hotline number seemed to pulse in the darkness. 10. Digits that represented a connection to a world outside her family's carefully controlled narrative. She didn't call. Not yet. But for the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a different story. One where she was the protagonist rather than the victim, where patterns of cruelty were broken rather than perpetuated, where the truth was documented and preserved rather than buried under layers of plausible explanation. Outside her window, the suburban night was quiet and still. But change was coming, and it would arrive carrying the weight of choices. Her choice to finally speak, to finally seek help, to finally break the silence that had protected Maya's secrets for far too long. The pattern began to emerge over the eye, following weeks like a photograph developing in slow motion, each incident adding another layer of detail to a picture that was becoming increasingly impossible to ignore. What had started as isolated accidents began to reveal themselves as part of a larger design, a systematic exploration of cruelty that Maya conducted with the methodical precision of the future medical professional she was training to become. 3. Days after the boiling water incident, Lora found all of her houseplants dead, their leaves brown and curled, their soil reeking of bleach. Maya had been watering them while Lora was at school, a helpful gesture that Mom had praised enthusiastically at dinner. "Your sister is so thoughtful," she'd said, beaming at Maya across the table. "She's been taking such good care of your little garden." The plants had been Laura's sanctuary, a small collection of succulents and ferns that she'd nursed from cuttings and seedlings. She'd arranged them on the windowsill in her bedroom, creating a miniature ecosystem that responded to her care with new growth and vibrant colors. They'd been the one thing in her life that belonged entirely to her, free from Maya's influence or manipulation. Maya had expressed appropriate dismay when she'd discovered the dead plants the next morning. "I don't understand what happened," she'd said, examining the crispy remains with what appeared to be genuine confusion. "I followed your watering instructions exactly. Maybe there was something wrong with the tap water? Or could it have been too much sunlight?" The explanations were plausible, delivered with the kind of scientific curiosity that made Maya seem like she was genuinely trying to solve a botanical mystery. But Lora had caught the faintest hint of satisfaction in her sister's voice, a microscopic note of pleasure that only someone who'd been listening for it would have detected. A week later, Laura's laptop mysteriously crashed, its hard drive corrupted beyond recovery. She'd been working on her college application essays, personal statements that had taken her months to craft and refine. Maya had been using the laptop the night before. Hers was being repaired, and she'd needed to finish a research paper for her psychology class. The timing was unfortunate but not suspicious, the kind of technological failure that happened to everyone eventually. "These things are so unpredictable," Maya had said sympathetically, sitting next to Lora on her bed as she stared at the blank screen. "All that work, just gone. But hey, maybe this is the universe telling you that your first drafts weren't quite ready anyway. Sometimes a fresh start is exactly what we need." Maya had offered to help rewrite the essays, to share her own successful application materials as templates. The gesture was generous, supportive, exactly what a caring older sister would do in such a situation. But it also meant that Lora's college applications would now bear Maya's influence, shaped by her vision of what admissions committees wanted to hear, rather than Lora's own authentic voice. The incidents weren't limited to property destruction. Maya had begun offering to drive Lora to school in the mornings, a sisterly kindness that Mom enthusiastically endorsed. "It's so nice to see you girls spending more time together," she'd said. Maya's setting such a good example of what family relationships should look like. But the drives weren't pleasant bonding experiences. Maya used the confined space of the car to conduct what she called psychological check-ins. Conversations that felt like therapy sessions administered by someone with no professional training and questionable motives. She would ask probing questions about Lora's friendships, her relationship with Jake, her deepest fears and insecurities, all under the guise of sisterly concern. "I've noticed you seem more withdrawn lately," Maya would say, her eyes focused on the road ahead with careful attention. "Are you having trouble connecting with people? I know how hard it can be when you're dealing with anxiety." The suggestions of psychological instability were subtle but persistent. Maya would reference imaginary conversations where Lora had supposedly expressed feelings of depression or social anxiety, creating a narrative of mental health struggles that existed only in Maya's carefully constructed version of reality. She would then offer to talk to their parents about getting Lora the help she needs, positioning herself as the concerned family member who was willing to facilitate difficult conversations. At school, things began to shift in ways that were initially too subtle to identify but gradually became unmistakable. Jake's texts became less frequent, his lunch invitations more hesitant. When Lora asked him directly what was wrong, he seemed uncomfortable, unwilling to meet her eyes. "Maya mentioned that you've been going through a tough time," he finally said during one of their conversations in the chemistry lab. "She's worried about you. She thinks maybe you need some space to figure things out." Maya had somehow made contact with Jake, positioning herself as the protective older sister who was concerned about her vulnerable younger sibling. The conversation had been brief, according to Jake's account, just a chance encounter in the hospital parking lot where Maya volunteered. She'd expressed gratitude that someone as kind as Jake was looking out for Lora, but had also suggested that Lora was dealing with some personal issues that made romantic relationships particularly challenging right now. "She didn't say anything specific," Jake assured Lora. "Just that you've been under a lot of stress lately and that she didn't want anyone to take advantage of that." The manipulation was brilliant in its subtlety. Maya hadn't forbidden the relationship or created obvious drama. Instead, she'd planted seeds of doubt about Lora's emotional stability while positioning herself as the caring family member who only wanted what was best for everyone involved. Jake's withdrawal wasn't cruel or calculated. It was the natural response of a teenage boy who'd been told, by someone with apparent authority, that pursuing a relationship might be harmful to the girl he cared about. Casey proved more resistant to Maya's influence. But even she began asking questions that suggested someone had been sharing concerns about Lora's well-being. "Your sister called me," she said one afternoon as they walked to their cars after school. "She wanted to make sure I knew about the kitchen accident, said she was worried that you might not be telling people how much pain you're in." The phone call had ostensibly been about practical matters. Maya wanted to ensure that Casey was aware of Lora's injuries so she could be supportive and understanding. But the conversation had also included subtle suggestions that Lora had been making concerning comments lately, expressing thoughts about feeling hopeless or overwhelmed. "She didn't say you were suicidal or anything dramatic like that," Casey clarified quickly. "Just that you've been more negative lately, more focused on dark thoughts. She's worried that you might be developing depression." Maya was systematically isolating Lora from her support network, not through dramatic confrontations or obvious sabotage, but through a campaign of manufactured concern that painted Lora as psychologically fragile and potentially unstable. Anyone who tried to get close to Lora was subtly warned that she was going through a difficult time, that she needed professional help rather than teenage romance or friendship drama. The psychological warfare escalated when Maya began volunteering at the guidance counselor's office at Lora's school. As a pre-med student with perfect grades and impeccable references, she was welcomed enthusiastically by the overworked staff. Her official duties involved filing paperwork and answering phones, but her real purpose was intelligence gathering and narrative control. Within a week of starting her volunteer position, Maya had casual conversations with 3 different teachers about Lora's recent changes in behavior. She expressed sisterly worry about Lora's mood, her decreased participation in class, her tendency to isolate herself during lunch periods. The concerns were presented with the kind of loving anxiety that made Maya seem like the ideal older sister: attentive, caring, proactive about getting help for a struggling sibling. Mrs. Rodriguez was the first teacher to approach Lora directly. She asked her to stay after English class one Thursday afternoon, her expression carrying the particular weight of an educator who'd been alerted to a potential problem. "Lora, I wanted to check in with you," she said, closing the classroom door, "to ensure privacy. Your sister mentioned that you've been having a difficult time lately. I've noticed you seem less engaged in class discussions, and I wanted to make sure you know that I'm here if you need someone to talk to." The intervention was well-intentioned, motivated by genuine concern for Lora's well-being. But it was also based on Maya's carefully crafted narrative of psychological decline, a story that existed more in Maya's imagination than in observable reality. Mrs. Rodriguez had been led to believe that Lora was struggling with depression, family stress, and social anxiety, problems that required adult intervention and professional support. "I'm fine," Lora said, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. How could she explain that her sister was conducting psychological experiments on her without sounding paranoid? How could she describe the systematic campaign of manipulation and control without appearing to be exactly the kind of unstable teenager that Maya had portrayed her as being? The guidance counselor, Ms. Jennifer Park, called Lora to her office the following week. Ms. Park was a kind woman in her 30s who genuinely cared about her students, but she was also overworked and understaffed, responsible for the mental health and academic guidance of nearly 400 teenagers. She relied heavily on family members and volunteers to help identify students who might be struggling. "Your sister has expressed some concerns about you," Ms. Park said gently, her office decorated with motivational posters and a collection of stress balls in various bright colors. "She's worried that you might be dealing with depression or anxiety, and she thinks it might be helpful for you to talk to someone." Maya had painted a picture of a younger sister who was increasingly withdrawn, who made concerning comments about feeling hopeless, who seemed to be struggling with the normal pressures of teenage life. The portrait was believable because it contained just enough truth to seem authentic. Lora had been more quiet lately, more reserved, more careful about what she said and to whom she said it. But the silence wasn't depression. It was survival strategy, a learned response to living with someone who used every piece of personal information as potential ammunition. Lora had become withdrawn because she'd discovered that sharing her thoughts and feelings with family members inevitably resulted in those vulnerabilities being weaponized against her. "I understand that family dynamics can be complicated," Ms. Park continued, "and sometimes it's easier to talk to someone outside the situation. I want you to know that anything we discuss here is confidential, and I'm here to support you, not judge you. The offer was genuine, but it was also compromised by Maya's influence. Ms. Park had already formed opinions about Lora's mental state based on Maya's reports, and those preconceptions would inevitably shape how she interpreted anything Lora might choose to share. If Lora complained about Maya's behavior, it would likely be seen as evidence of the family's stress and sisterly conflict that Maya had already described. If she remained silent, it would be interpreted as confirmation of her supposed psychological struggles. The appointments with Ms. Park became a weekly occurrence, sessions that felt more like interrogations than therapy. Maya had positioned herself as the primary source of information about Lora's home life, and her reports painted an increasingly concerning picture of a teenager spiraling into depression and anxiety. According to Maya, Lora had been making statements about feeling worthless, expressing fears about her future, and showing signs of self-destructive behavior. "Your sister mentioned that you've been having trouble sleeping," Ms. Park would say during one of their sessions. "Are you experiencing nightmares or racing thoughts that keep you awake?" The questions were based on Maya's fictional accounts of late-night conversations that had never happened, supposed confessions of psychological distress that existed only in Maya's carefully constructed narrative. But once these facts were established in the official record, they became part of Lora's profile, influencing how every adult at school perceived and interacted with her. Maya had also begun documenting what she called concerning incidents at home. She kept a journal, supposedly for her psychology classes, that detailed Lora's mood swings, her social isolation, her academic struggles. The entries were written with clinical detachment, full of psychological terminology and theoretical frameworks that made them sound scientific and objective. "Subject exhibits increased irritability and resistance to family interaction," read one typical entry. "Displays paranoid ideation regarding normal family dynamics. Mood appears consistently dysthymic with episodes of heightened anxiety, particularly in social situations." The language was borrowed from her textbooks. Diagnostic criteria applied to normal teenage behavior in ways that made ordinary moodiness sound like pathological dysfunction. Maya was building a case for Lora's mental instability, creating documentation that could be used to support whatever intervention she ultimately decided was necessary. The breaking point came during a family dinner 3 weeks after the boiling water incident. Dad had made his famous chili, a recipe he'd inherited from his own father and refined over years of Sunday afternoon cooking experiments. The dining room smelled like cumin and cayenne pepper, and outside the window, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall in lazy spirals. Maya had been unusually quiet during the meal, responding to conversation with distracted nods and half-heard murmurs. She claimed to be preoccupied with an upcoming exam, but Lora had learned to recognize the signs of one of Maya's experiments reaching its culmination. There was a tension in her sister's posture, an anticipatory energy that suggested something significant was about to happen. "I need to talk to you both about something," Maya said finally, setting down her spoon and looking directly at their parents. "I've been worried about Lora for weeks now, and I think it's time we addressed what's been happening." Mom and Dad exchanged glances across the table, their expressions shifting from casual dinner conversation to parental concern. Maya had their full attention now, positioned as the responsible family member who was brave enough to broach a difficult topic. "I know this is hard to hear," Maya continued, her voice carrying exactly the right note of reluctant disclosure. "But I think Lora has been struggling with some serious mental health issues. I've been trying to support her on my own, but I'm starting to worry that she might need professional help." The accusation landed in the middle of the dinner table like a bomb, reshaping the entire family dynamic in a single sentence. Lora felt the familiar sensation of the ground shifting beneath her feet, the disorienting experience of watching someone else define her reality with absolute confidence and apparent authority. "What kind of issues?" Dad asked, his voice cautious, but concerned. Maya had prepared for this moment, gathering evidence and constructing arguments with the same methodical approach she applied to her academic work. She described a pattern of concerning behavior, mood swings, social isolation, paranoid thoughts about family members, possible self-harm tendencies evidenced by the increasing frequency of accidents. "She's been making comments about feeling hopeless," Maya said, her voice heavy with sisterly worry. "And I've noticed some changes in her appearance and behavior that really concern me. The guidance counselor at school has expressed similar worries." The mention of school involvement added official weight to Maya's concerns. If professional educators were worried about Lora's mental state, then clearly this wasn't just normal teenage drama or sisterly conflict. This was a legitimate psychological crisis that required immediate family intervention. "Lora, sweetheart," Mom said, reaching across the table to touch her hand, "why didn't you tell us you were struggling? We want to help you." The question assumed the truth of Maya's narrative, treating her supposed confession as established fact rather than unproven allegation. Lora found herself in the impossible position of trying to defend against accusations that were presented as loving concern, trying to refute a psychological profile that had been constructed with enough clinical language to sound authoritative and objective. "I'm not struggling," Lora said, but her voice sounded weak even to her own ears. "Maya's making things sound worse than they are." "See?" Maya said gently, as if Lora's denial was itself evidence of psychological dysfunction. "This is exactly what I've been worried about. She's not able to recognize when she needs help, and she's starting to interpret normal family concern as some kind of attack." The logic was circular and inescapable. Any protest from Lora would be interpreted as confirmation of her supposed paranoid ideation. Any emotional response would be seen as evidence of mood instability. Any attempt to explain the real dynamics of her relationship with Maya would be dismissed as the confused perceptions of someone who wasn't thinking clearly. Dad cleared his throat, a sound that usually preceded his most serious parental pronouncements. "Maybe we should consider getting you some professional support, Lora. Just someone to talk to, help you work through whatever you're dealing with." The suggestion was reasonable, motivated by genuine parental love and concern, but it was also based entirely on Maya's manufactured crisis, a psychological emergency that existed only in her carefully documented reports and clinical observations. Maya had successfully convinced their parents that Lora was experiencing a mental health crisis that required immediate intervention. "I think that's a good idea," Maya said, her relief seeming genuine and profound. "I've been so worried about her, trying to figure out how to help. I'm just glad we can finally address this as a family." That night, alone in her room with the door closed and her parents' worried voices drifting up from the kitchen below, Lora finally understood the full scope of Maya's long-term experiment. This had never been about random cruelty or casual bullying. Maya was conducting a systematic study of psychological manipulation, using their family as her laboratory and Lora as her primary research subject. The goal wasn't just to hurt Lora or to establish dominance. Maya was testing her ability to construct and control narrative, to shape other people's perceptions of reality through careful documentation and strategic revelation. She was practicing the kind of psychological influence that would serve her well in medical school and beyond, learning to present herself as the authoritative voice in any situation involving human suffering or family crisis. Maya's ultimate thesis was simple but terrifying. She wanted to prove that she could convince everyone around them that Lora was mentally ill, unstable, and in need of treatment for problems that Maya herself had created. The burns on Lora's arms weren't just physical assault. They were the foundation for a larger narrative of self-harm and psychological dysfunction that Maya was building with methodical precision. The beautiful irony, from Maya's perspective, was that the more Lora tried to defend herself against these accusations, the more she would appear to validate them. Any anger would be interpreted as mood instability. Any fear would be seen as anxiety disorder. Any attempt to explain the truth would be dismissed as paranoid delusion. Maya had trapped her in a psychological maze with no exit, a narrative prison, where every door led back to the same conclusion. Lora Martinez was mentally ill and needed help that only Maya was qualified to provide. But Maya had made one crucial miscalculation. She'd assumed that her documentation was the only record of what had happened, that her clinical observations would be the sole source of information about Lora's supposed psychological decline. She'd forgotten about Patricia Chen's photographs, stored in a hospital database with timestamps and metadata that told a very different story about patterns of abuse and carefully inflicted harm. She'd overlooked the crisis hotline number that was still folded in Lora's backpack, a connection to resources that existed outside Maya's sphere of influence. Most importantly, she'd underestimated Lora's capacity for survival, her ability to endure psychological warfare while quietly documenting the truth, waiting for the right moment to reveal the real pattern that had been emerging over months of systematic manipulation and control. The war Maya had started was far from over, but the battlefield was about to shift in ways she hadn't anticipated, and the weapons she'd so carefully crafted were about to be turned against her with devastating precision. The appointment with Dr. Sarah Hassan was scheduled for the following Tuesday afternoon, arranged by Mom with the efficiency of someone who had finally found a concrete action to take in response to what felt like an escalating family crisis. Dr. Hassan specialized in adolescent psychology, with particular expertise in depression, anxiety, and family systems therapy. Her office was located in a modern medical complex 20 minutes from their house, sharing space with pediatricians and orthodontists in a building designed to feel welcoming rather than clinical. Maya had insisted on driving Lora to the appointment, positioning herself as the supportive family member who wanted to ensure that her sister received the help she needed. During the drive, she offered a steady stream of encouragement and reassurance, her voice carrying exactly the right mixture of concern and optimism. Dr. Hassan comes highly recommended, Maya said, navigating the late afternoon traffic with careful attention. She's published research on family dynamics and teenage mental health. I think you're really going to like her approach. The fact that Maya had researched Dr. Hassan's background and credentials should have been reassuring, evidence of a sister who cared enough to ensure that Lora received quality care. But Lora had learned to be suspicious of Maya's helpfulness, to look for the underlying agenda that always seemed to accompany her most generous gestures. "Are you going to sit in on the session?" Lora asked. "Only if you want me to," Maya replied, though her tone suggested that she hoped the answer would be yes. Dr. Hassan mentioned that sometimes it's helpful to have family members involved, especially in the beginning when she's trying to understand the full picture. The waiting room smelled like lavender and vanilla, with soft music playing from hidden speakers and a collection of magazines spread across low tables. Maya sat next to Lora on one of the comfortable couches, occasionally reaching over to squeeze her hand in a gesture of sisterly solidarity. To anyone watching, they would have looked like a loving family dealing with a difficult situation with grace and mutual support. Dr. Hassan emerged from her office precisely on time, a woman in her early 40s with warm brown eyes and graying hair pulled back in a professional bun. She greeted both girls with genuine warmth, her manner suggesting someone who understood that family dynamics were always complex and that healing required patience, trust, and careful attention to multiple perspectives. "Lora, I'm so glad to meet you," she said, extending her hand. "And Maya, thank you for being such a supportive sister. It means a lot when family members are willing to be part of the healing process." The initial session was scheduled to include both sisters, allowing Dr. Hassan to observe their interaction patterns and gather information from multiple sources. Maya had suggested this approach during her phone consultation with the doctor, explaining that she had insights into Lora's behavior that might be helpful in developing an effective treatment plan. Dr. Hassan's office was decorated with a combination of professional credentials and personal touches, diplomas and certificates on one wall, family photographs and artwork from young patients on another. The overall effect was of a space that took itself seriously while remaining fundamentally human and accessible. "Why don't you both tell me what brought you here today?" Dr. Hassan said, settling into her chair with a notepad and pen. "Maya, would you like to start?" What followed was a masterclass in psychological manipulation disguised as loving concern. Maya described months of watching her younger sister struggle with depression, anxiety, and what appeared to be increasingly concerning thoughts about self-harm. She spoke with the clinical vocabulary of someone who'd spent years studying psychology, using terms like emotional dysregulation and maladaptive coping mechanisms, with the casual fluency of a graduate student. "I've been documenting some of her behavioral patterns," Maya said, pulling out a leather portfolio that contained her handwritten observations. "I thought it might be helpful for you to see the progression over time." The journal entries were presented with academic objectivity, dated observations that painted a picture of steady psychological decline. According to Maya's records, Lora had been making statements about feeling worthless, showing signs of social withdrawal, and engaging in what appeared to be deliberate self-harm disguised as household accidents. The incident with the boiling water was particularly concerning, Maya continued, her voice heavy with worry. She insisted it was an accident, but the pattern of the burns was unusual. And this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Dr. Hassan listened with professional attention, occasionally taking notes but mostly focusing on the dynamics between the two sisters. She observed Maya's body language, the way she leaned forward when discussing Lora's supposed struggles, the careful balance of concern and clinical detachment in her voice. She also watched Lora, noting her silence, the tension in her posture, the way she seemed to withdraw further into herself as Maya's account continued. "Lora," Dr. Hassan said when Maya had finished, "what's your perspective on what Maya has shared?" The question was asked with genuine curiosity rather than skepticism. But Lora could feel the weight of Maya's documentation in the room, the carefully constructed narrative that had already shaped Dr. Hassan's initial impressions. How could she explain that every concerning behavior Maya had described was either fabricated or taken wildly out of context? How could she make anyone understand that her sister was conducting psychological experiments on her without sounding paranoid and delusional? "Some of it is true," Lora said carefully, "but not in the way Maya is presenting it. I have been more quiet lately, but that's because..." She trailed off, suddenly aware that any criticism of Maya would likely be interpreted as evidence of the family conflict and paranoid ideation that were already part of her supposed psychological profile. "Because?" Dr. Hassan prompted gently. "Because it's hard to trust anyone when everything you say gets used against you somehow." Maya's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression of satisfaction that Dr. Hassan caught, but Lora missed. To Maya, this response was perfect. It suggested paranoid thinking while avoiding specific allegations that could be easily disproven. Lora was describing exactly the kind of trust issues and family conflict that Maya had already identified as central to her sister's psychological struggles. "That sounds really difficult," Dr. Hassan said with genuine empathy. "Can you tell me more about what it feels like when the things you say get used against you?" The question was therapeutically appropriate, designed to help Lora explore her feelings and experiences in a safe environment. But it was also a trap, requiring Lora to either provide specific examples that would sound like attacks on Maya, or to speak in vague generalizations that would reinforce the impression of paranoid ideation. "It's hard to explain," Lora said, finally. "It's more about patterns than specific incidents." Dr. Hassan spent the next 40 minutes conducting what felt like a standard intake interview, asking about Lora's mood, sleep patterns, academic performance, and social relationships. Many of the questions seemed to be based on information Maya had already provided, assumptions about depression and anxiety that shaped the line of inquiry from the beginning. Maya mentioned that you've been having some thoughts about self-harm, Dr. Hassan said toward the end of the session. Can you tell me about that? I haven't been having thoughts about self-harm, Lora replied, her voice stronger than it had been throughout most of the appointment. But the incident with the boiling water was not self-harm. It was an accident. The lie felt necessary, a form of self-protection in an environment where telling the truth about Maya would likely be interpreted as evidence of mental illness. Dr. Hassan made notes on her pad, her expression thoughtful but unreadable. When the session ended, she asked to speak with Maya privately for a few minutes, a request that Lora interpreted as confirmation that she'd failed some kind of psychological evaluation. In the waiting room, alone with magazines about parenting and adolescent development, Lora finally allowed herself to fully understand what Maya had accomplished. She'd successfully convinced a mental health professional that Lora was suffering from depression, anxiety, and possible self-harm behaviors. The documentation Maya had provided would become part of Lora's permanent medical record, following her through any future interactions with healthcare providers, college counselors, or employers who required psychological evaluations. Maya had weaponized the mental health system itself, using professional resources and therapeutic language to pathologize normal responses to abuse and manipulation. Any future attempts by Lora to report Maya's behavior would now be filtered through the lens of her supposed psychological instability, dismissed as the paranoid fantasies of someone who'd already been professionally diagnosed with trust issues and family conflict. When Maya emerged from Dr. Hassan's office 15 minutes later, her expression carried the satisfaction of someone who'd received confirmation of her concerns. She scheduled Lora's next appointment for the following week, positioning herself as the responsible family member who would ensure that treatment continued until her sister was healthy again. Dr. Hassan thinks weekly sessions would be beneficial, Maya said as they walked back to the car. She's also going to talk to Mom and Dad about some strategies for supporting you at home. The drive back was quiet, Maya seemingly lost in thought while Lora stared out the window at the suburban landscape, rolling past. But Lora's mind was racing, finally beginning to understand the full scope of what she was up against. Maya hadn't just been conducting random experiments in cruelty. She'd been building a comprehensive case for Lora's psychological dysfunction, creating documentation that would make any future accusations seem like the delusional fantasies of someone who clearly needed professional help. That evening, Mom and Dad sat Lora down for what they called a family meeting, but which felt more like an intervention. Maya had briefed them on Dr. Hassan's initial assessment, sharing her professional opinion that Lora was indeed struggling with significant mental health challenges that would require ongoing treatment and family support. Dr. Hassan thinks it would be helpful if we all work together to create a more supportive environment at home, Mom said, her voice carrying the particular tone of a parent who'd been given expert guidance on how to handle a difficult situation. Maya's going to help us implement some strategies for reducing your stress and helping you feel more secure. The irony was devastating. Maya was now positioned as Lora's primary support system, the family member most qualified to help her navigate her psychological struggles and implement her treatment plan. Any future accidents or incidents could be attributed to Lora's mental health issues, while Maya's role as caregiver and advocate would make her seem even more sympathetic and dedicated. "No, this is overwhelming," Maya said, sitting next to Lora on the couch and placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "But I want you to know that I'm going to be here for you every step of the way. We're going to get through this together." The performance was flawless, delivered with exactly the right combination of love, concern, and determination. Maya had successfully convinced everyone around them that she was the hero of this story, the devoted sister who was sacrificing her own time and energy to help a struggling family member recover from mental illness. But Maya had made one crucial error. In her psychological warfare campaign, she'd been so focused on constructing her narrative and documenting Lora's supposed dysfunction that she'd overlooked the possibility that other people might be conducting their own documentation, creating their own records of what was actually happening. Patricia Chen had not forgotten about the geometric precision of the burns on Lora's arms. The photographs she'd taken were still stored in the hospital's database, but more importantly, they'd been flagged for review by the hospital's child protection team. Patricia had seen enough abuse cases to recognize patterns that suggested intentional harm rather than accidental injury, and something about Lora's case had continued to bother her long after the family had left the emergency room. 3 days. After Lora's appointment with Dr. Hassan, Patricia made a decision that would ultimately unravel Maya's carefully constructed narrative. She called social services. The call wasn't based on dramatic new evidence or shocking revelations. It was based on professional instinct, years of experience reading between the lines of family stories that didn't quite add up. Patricia had kept thinking about the burns, about the way they'd been positioned and spaced, about the family dynamics she'd observed in the emergency room. Something felt wrong, and her professional obligation required her to report her concerns to the appropriate authorities. Social worker Maria Santos received the referral on a Thursday morning, along with copies of Patricia's photographs and medical records. Maria had been working child protection cases for 8 years, long enough to develop her own instincts about the difference between accidents and abuse. The images of Lora's arms immediately caught her attention. The parallel lines, the consistent depth, the deliberate spacing that suggested intentional rather than accidental contact with boiling water. Maria's initial investigation began with a review of the family's history with social services, medical records, and school reports. What she found was a family with no previous involvement with child protection services, stellar community reputation, and a daughter who was currently receiving treatment for mental health issues that included family conflict and possible self-harm behaviors. On the surface, it appeared that Patricia's concerns might be unfounded. The family looked stable, supportive, and proactive about addressing their daughter's psychological struggles. Maya's documentation of Lora's behavioral problems provided a plausible explanation for any family tension, while Dr. Hassan's professional assessment suggested that the issues were related to adolescent mental health rather than family dysfunction. But Maria had learned to look beyond surface appearances, to pay attention to patterns that might not be immediately obvious. She scheduled a home visit, planning to observe the family dynamics firsthand, and interview each family member separately to get a more complete picture of what was actually happening in the Martinez household. The appointment was set for the following Monday afternoon, a timing that would allow Maria to observe the family's normal routines and interactions without the artificial atmosphere of a scheduled meeting. She would arrive unannounced, as was standard protocol for initial child protection investigations, giving the family no opportunity to prepare or stage manage their responses. Maya, of course, knew nothing about Patricia's report or Maria's investigation. She was too busy implementing the next phase of her psychological experiment, using her new role as Lora's primary support person to exercise even greater control over her sister's daily life and emotional well-being. But change was coming, carried in official reports and professional assessments that would soon reveal the difference between Maya's carefully crafted documentation and the objective evidence that existed in hospital databases and social services files. The pattern Maya had been so careful to create was about to be examined by people trained to recognize the real patterns that emerged when families tried to hide the truth behind walls of manufactured concern and clinical language. For the first time in months, the balance of power was about to shift, and the story Maya had been so carefully constructing was about to collide with the reality that other people had been quietly documenting all along. Maria Santos arrived at the Martinez house on a crisp Monday afternoon in late November when the autumn leaves had finally surrendered to winter's approach and the suburban lawns were carpeted in brown and gold. She parked her unmarked sedan in the driveway and took a moment to observe the house itself, a well-maintained 2-story colonial with perfectly trimmed hedges and seasonal decorations that suggested a family that cared about appearances and Community perception. The doorbell chimed with a cheerful melody, and after a few moments, Susan Martinez opened the door wearing the kind of casual but put-together outfit that suggested someone who worked from home but maintained professional standards. Her smile was warm and welcoming, though Maria detected a flicker of confusion and concern when she introduced herself as a social worker conducting a routine follow-up on a medical report. "I'm sorry, I think there must be some mistake," Susan said, her voice carrying the polite firmness of someone accustomed to handling administrative confusion. "We haven't requested any social services, and our daughter is already receiving professional support for her challenges." Maria had heard this response many times before. Families who'd never had involvement with child protection services often assumed that social workers only appeared when parents had directly requested assistance. The idea that medical professionals or concerned community members might initiate investigations was foreign to their experience, and their initial reaction was usually confusion rather than defensiveness. "May I come in?" Maria asked gently. "I'd like to explain the reason for my visit and speak with your family about some concerns that have been brought to our attention." The living room was decorated with the kind of careful attention to detail that spoke of both financial comfort and aesthetic sensibility. Family photographs covered the mantelpiece and side tables, documenting years of vacations, school events, and holiday celebrations. Maya and Lora appeared in dozens of pictures, smiling sisters captured in moments of apparent happiness and familial harmony. But Maria had learned to look beyond the surface narrative of family photographs. She noticed that in many of the more recent pictures, Laura's smiles seemed forced, her body language suggesting someone who was present but not entirely comfortable. Maya, by contrast, appeared consistently confident and relaxed, often positioned, slightly in front of her younger sister in a way that suggested dominance or protection, depending on how one chose to interpret the family dynamics. When Maya entered the living room, Maria immediately understood why Patricia Chen had been bothered by the family's story. Maya moved with the kind of controlled confidence that suggested someone accustomed to managing situations and people. Her demeanor professional and helpful, but somehow too polished for a 19-year-old college student dealing with a family crisis. "You must be Maya," Maria said, extending her hand. "I'm Maria Santos from Social Services. I'm here to follow up on some concerns that were raised about your sister's recent injury." Maya's response was textbook perfect, appropriate surprise, immediate concern for her sister's well-being, and eager cooperation with whatever official process had been initiated. She explained that Lora had been struggling with mental health issues that sometimes manifested in accidents and self-harm behaviors, and that the family was already working with a qualified professional to address these challenges. "Dr. Hassan has been wonderful," Maya said, settling onto the couch with the kind of graceful attention to posture that suggested someone always aware of how she appeared to others. "She's helped us understand that Laura's incident was part of a larger pattern of psychological distress that we're working to address as a family." When Lora finally appeared, summoned from her room by her mother's call, Maria immediately noticed the difference between the sisters. Where Maya radiated controlled confidence, Lora seemed to carry herself like someone who'd learned to be invisible, to take up as little space as possible. Her movements were careful and measured, her responses to questions brief and guarded. "Lora, I'd like to talk with you privately for a few minutes," Maria said. "Is there somewhere we could sit together? Just the two of us." The suggestion caused a brief moment of tension in the room. Maya immediately offered to accompany them, positioning herself as Laura's primary support person and explaining that Dr. Hassan had recommended family involvement in all discussions about Laura's mental health treatment. Susan nodded in agreement, clearly viewing Maya's presence as protective rather than intrusive. But Maria had conducted hundreds of these interviews, and she knew that the most important information often emerged only when children felt truly safe from the influence of family members who might be part of the problem. She gently but firmly insisted on private conversation, explaining that it was standard protocol and that she would speak with Maya separately afterward. In the kitchen, away from the carefully curated perfection of the living room, Maria noticed details that told a different story about the family's daily life. The refrigerator was covered with Maya's academic achievements, Dean's List certificates, scholarship announcements, acceptance letters from medical school programs. Lora's accomplishments were notably absent, as if her successes weren't worth documenting or celebrating. "Tell me about the day you were burned," Maria said, taking out a notebook, but keeping her tone conversational rather than interrogative. Lora repeated the familiar story about helping with dinner, the heavy pot, the accidental spill. But Maria was listening for more than just words. She was observing body language, noting the way Lora's voice became flat and rehearsed when describing certain details, the way her eyes focused on the table rather than making direct contact. "The medical report mentions that the burn pattern was unusual," Maria said carefully. "The nurse who treated you took some photographs for your medical records. Have you seen those pictures?" Lora shook her head, but something in her expression shifted, almost imperceptibly. For the first time during their conversation, she seemed genuinely surprised, as if she hadn't considered that evidence of her injuries might exist beyond her family's control. "Would you like to see them?" Maria asked, pulling out her tablet and accessing the secure database that contained Patricia's photographs. The images were stark and clinical, showing Lora's arms with the kind of objective clarity that stripped away all possibility of subjective interpretation. The burns formed perfect parallel lines, spaced with mathematical precision, extending from her wrists to her elbows in a pattern that would have been impossible to create accidentally. Lora stared at the photographs for a long moment, seeing her own injuries from an outsider's perspective for the first time. The geometric precision was undeniable, the deliberate spacing obvious even to someone without medical training. These weren't the chaotic splashes and irregular burns that would have resulted from an accidental spill. They were the precise, measured wounds that could only have been created intentionally. "Lora," Maria said gently, "these photographs tell a different story than the one your family has been sharing. I need you to know that whatever happened to you, it wasn't your fault, and there are people who can help you if you're ready to tell the truth." The moment stretched between them like a bridge that Lora could either cross or retreat from. On one side was the familiar safety of silence, the protection of a lie that kept her family intact, even if it left her isolated and vulnerable. On the other side was the terrifying unknown of speaking truth to someone who might actually believe her, might actually be able to help. "Maya did it on purpose," Lora whispered, the words barely audible but carrying the weight of months of suppressed truth. "She poured the water on my arms deliberately. She was conducting an experiment." What followed was the longest conversation Lora had had with an adult about her real life in years. She told Maria about the dead plants, the corrupted laptop, the systematic isolation from friends and potential romantic partners. She described Maya's behavioral experiments, the way she used psychological terminology to justify cruelty, the clinical detachment with which she observed and documented Lora's responses to various forms of manipulation and control. The most difficult part wasn't convincing Maria to believe her. It was learning to believe in herself again after months of having her reality systematically dismantled by someone she'd trusted. Maria listened without interruption, taking careful notes and asking clarifying questions that demonstrated she understood the psychological complexity of what Lora had endured. Within 48 hours, Maya was removed from the family home pending a full investigation. The journal entries she'd kept as documentation of Lora's supposed mental illness became evidence of her own calculated cruelty. Her psychology textbooks, highlighted and annotated with observations about human behavior and pain responses, painted a chilling picture of someone who had weaponized academic knowledge for personal experimentation. Dr. Hassan, when presented with Patricia's photographs and Maria's investigation findings, immediately recognized how thoroughly she'd been manipulated. Maya's clinical vocabulary and seemingly objective documentation had convinced a trained professional to participate in what was essentially an elaborate gaslighting campaign. The realization led to significant changes in Dr. Hassan's intake procedures and a renewed emphasis on independent observation rather than family-reported symptoms. Maya's academic career ended abruptly when the investigation expanded to include her volunteer work at both the hospital and Lora's school. Medical school acceptance letters were withdrawn, scholarships revoked, and her perfect transcript became meaningless in the face of documented evidence of psychological abuse. The precision with which she'd conducted her experiments suggested a level of premeditation that made her actions particularly disturbing to the professionals who reviewed her case. The family struggled to rebuild after Maya's departure. Susan and their father attended therapy sessions to understand how they'd missed the signs of systematic abuse happening under their own roof. They learned about manipulation tactics, the difference between concern and control, and the ways that academic achievement could mask deeply troubling behavior patterns. Lora's actual therapy with a new psychologist focused on healing from psychological trauma rather than treating fabricated mental illness. She learned to trust her own perceptions again, to recognize that her responses to Maya's abuse had been normal and healthy rather than pathological. The process was slow and sometimes painful, but it was built on truth rather than manufactured. Crisis. 6 months later, Lora received a letter from Patricia Chen, who had followed the case through its resolution. The nurse's decision to document those geometric burn patterns and make that crucial phone call had potentially saved Lora's life, or at least her sanity. Patricia's note was simple. Sometimes we have to trust our instincts about patterns, even when everyone else sees accidents. I'm proud of your courage in finally speaking your truth. Maya was eventually diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder and narcissistic traits during court-ordered psychological evaluation. She served 18 months in juvenile detention and was required to complete extensive psychological treatment before being released. The precision of her manipulation had been extraordinary, but ultimately, the truth had patterns of its own. Patterns that trained professionals like Patricia and Maria had been able to recognize and act upon. Lora kept Patricia's crisis hotline number in her wallet for years afterward, not because she needed it, but as a reminder that there were people in the world who looked beyond surface explanations to see the truth that others tried to hide. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.